So, hello everybody. My name is Peter Larson. I am the chair of the Ottawa Forum on Israel-Palestine. And today we're dealing with something that's going on today inside Israel, this week inside Israel, which is Israel's expulsion of Palestinian Bedouins for their lands. It's going on today, but it's actually started a long time ago. We have three informative guest speakers who are going to help us to understand the situation. Maybe the next slide, Yasmin, we will give out the agenda. So right now we're starting 3 minutes late. This is the welcome to everybody. I'm going to start off giving a bit of background to the historic background to the situation of the Bedouin in the Negev. And then we'll have presentations by Dr. Yousef Jabareen, a former member of the Knesset, now an academic, who's very familiar with the situation all over 48 Palestine, over Israel, including what's going on in the Negev. And we're thrilled to have a young Palestinian Bedouin activist who knows Canada well, Adan Alajooj, I'll say that pretty closely, who is on the spot, and we'll be able to talk about what's happening to her family. After that, Grafton Ross, who is the vice chair of the Ottawa Forum on Israel-Palestine and head of research, is going to share some information about the Jewish National Fund in Canada. And then we'll get into the question and answer period, okay? So many people on this call will already be quite familiar with the Israel-Palestine situation, but perhaps not everybody is. So I'll just start with some very basic information. This is a map of the area. You can see the yellow area is what Canada recognizes as Israel, and the white area is what Canada recognizes as the occupied Palestinian territories of the West Bank, which is the larger kidney-shaped area in white, and then Gaza, which is in the bottom left corner, the Gaza Strip in the bottom left corner. Israel today is surrounded by Egypt in the bottom left, Jordan, very long border with Jordan. Up in the top where it says Golan Heights, Israel has actually now taken that over from Syria. So it's occupied the Golan Heights, and then Lebanon at the top. And of course, it is flanked by the Mediterranean Sea on the left. Next slide. The area we're going to talk about today, though, is the Negev, which more or less is the bottom half of Israel. And you can see its borders there, has a very long border with Egypt and a very long border with Jordan. Its total population today is about 600,000, although at the time that Israel was created, there were a lot fewer people there, and they were mostly Bedouin. Now that has changed somewhat. The population of the Negev today is about 10% of the Israeli total. Next slide. This shows you quite dramatically the rainfall patterns in the Negev. You can see that the bottom half of that bottom half is basically barren desert. There's really not much possibility for agricultural or pastoral development there. But the top half or the top third of the Negev is suitable for pastoral, agricultural, sheep and goats and grains and so on. And that is where today and historically most of the Bedouins, Palestinian Bedouins, have lived. Next slide. After 1948, the state of Israel decided to take over all of the land of the Negev and tried to concentrate the Bedouins in 7 communities in what's called a sayaj. And you can see on the right-hand side, this sort of looks like a pot with a handle. Sayaj, that's it, concentrated if they could, they tried to force the Bedouin into that area. And you can see in the map on the left where various Bedouin tribes fled. They fled to Egypt, they fled to Jordan, or fled or were forced out. Some of them fled up into what became the West Bank, or even into the north of Israel. There are Bedouins in the north of Israel today as well. Those who that's fine, you can do that. Those who stayed, refused to run away, are in what Israel calls today unrecognized villages. And we'll talk a bit about unrecognized village. And I suspect, Adan, that's the situation of the village that your family comes from. It's interesting to make a comparison between settler colonialism in Canada and settler colonialism in Israel. Of course, the countries are different. Canada's vast, Israel is tiny, but basically the thrust was the same: to take over the land, as we did in all of Western Canada, ignoring indigenous title, just ignoring it, and concentrating people in very small areas. In Canada, we call them reserves. In Israel, they call them the Sayaj, or in fact, you could say the whole of the West Bank is kind of a reserve as well. Sort of, and in both cases, in Canada and in Israel, the native people in Canada are citizens. The Bedouin in Israel are citizens, but they're not really treated as if they were real citizens. They're not treated like other, in our case, white citizens. They're forcibly expelled. And then in both cases, the state, Canada and Israel, encourages the immigration of settlers. And Canada, we all know, those of us Canadians know that there was a huge waves of immigration to Canada to take over lands that had been expropriated from our indigenous people. And that is the same process that has gone on in Israel as well. Next slide. So why does Israel want to Judaize the Negev? Is it just because they're mean, or are there some strategic reasons? And I think, and I'm happy to have Yousef or Adan disagree with me if they don't agree with me later on, but I think there are three main reasons why they want to take over the Negev and to Judaize it. And by the way, that is not my term, that's their term, to Judaize the Negev. The first is defensive. Having expelled many Bedouins to Egypt and Jordan, of course, they had to fear that those people would want to come back. So there's a defensive reason. They want to make sure that the land that they expropriated remains expropriated. And of course, the Negev has these very long borders that are hard to manage as well. There's also an offensive reason, particularly military reasons. Israel has its nuclear base in Dimona. That's where Israel has 70 some nuclear bombs. And those bombs would be delivered by aircraft. And there's more than one very large Israeli aircraft base in the Negev. And in addition, if you look way down at the bottom, that little town at the bottom is called Eilat, and that's on the Gulf of Aqaba. And that's a naval base for Israel. So it provides Israeli naval capacity to move out into the Red Sea, which is a very important strategic element. So the Negev has a very important military element for Israel. And finally, the Negev itself has some economic value. It's not while it's lightly populated, it has some economic value. Raw materials, onshore and offshore, and agriculture. And if you look in the next slide, you can see that one of the ways Israel has done that, Judaize the Negev, is to bring in water. They have, in the late 50s, they created these huge water pipes that you can see in the map on the left, called the National Water Carrier, where they brought water from the Jordan River system, which deprives both Jordan and the West Bank of water. And everybody knows if you put water in the desert, you can make it bloom. So Israel has made the northern part of the Negev bloom, and you can see that picture up on the right by bringing in water that was somewhere else. I also included two pictures, one of their significant Air Force bases, and a picture from the Guardian of their nuclear research station at Dimona. Next slide. This expulsion is not done peacefully, or at least most Palestinians don't like being kicked out of their houses, and they will resist as best they can. And Israel, down the bottom right-hand corner, we have a picture of one of these unrecognized Bedouin villages, to which Israel provides no water, no electricity, schools, or internet, and so on. And they're trying to forcibly expel people. The upper left-hand corner shows you a picture from a Bedouin home that's been destroyed by Israel. Now, I want to interrupt this just for a second to make it very clear, we're talking about Israel. We're not talking about the West Bank. It occurs to us that this presentation today comes 2 weeks after Amnesty International came out with a very significant report accusing Israel of apartheid, not just in the West Bank, but inside Israel. And this is a dramatic example of apartheid unfolding before our very eyes over the last couple of weeks. Next slide. So one of the tools used for this expropriation is an organization called the JNF, the Jewish National Fund. You know, it operates over all of Israel and the occupied territories, and it owns about 13% of the land of Israel, much of it confiscated from Palestinians, like the land that we're talking about in the Negev. And according to JNF rules, the land it owns is exclusively for Jewish use. And many of the Bedouin lands have been confiscated by the JNF. And here you see some bulldozers tearing up Bedouin lands and planting trees for new Jewish communities. Next slide.
There is no freedom here, there is no rights here, and this has to stop today.
Can you stop that for a second? I just want to introduce what we're saying. So we picked up a little video here. That actually is our guest, Adan Alajooj, who's going to talk a little bit about this, but this is a recording that's just been made public, and it really demonstrates with significant clarity the process that's going on here. So please continue. It's a 3-minute video.
Today, the protest started peacefully at the entrance of Sa'wa village, where the men and women gathered protesting for their rights because the Israeli apartheid is trying to rip their homes from them, is trying to take their homes away.
What are they saying, Adan? What are they saying?
They're saying that with all their soul, with all their blood, with all their might, they will protect their land, al-Naqab.
Thank you.
تأتي استراتيجية التشجير لكي يشجروا تلك المنطقة المتواصلة بين المستعمرتين ويفرضون السيطرة على هذه المنطقة كليا.
That's the Israeli Interior Minister talking there. And the current Prime Minister. Well, that gives you a bit of a sense of the drama and the danger that's going on right now. I'd like to introduce 3 speakers to help us understand the situation. Yousef Jabareen, I've known Yousef for at least 10 years. He spent a week in Ottawa about 5 years ago. Yousef is, of course, a Palestinian citizen of Israel. He has a law degree from the university, Hebrew University. He also has a PhD from Georgetown University and was for 6 years a member of the Israeli Knesset. So Yousef, thank you so much for joining us today. Our second speaker is Adan Alajooj, and you already have a bit of a taste of her from watching that video. Adan lived for 5, 7, 8 years in Canada. I'm thrilled to have a young Palestinian Bedouin activist on the ground with some knowledge of the Canadian situation. So Adan, thank you so much for joining us. And finally, we have Grafton Ross. Grafton is a geographer by training. He is vice chair of my organization, the Ottawa Forum on Israel-Palestine, and he's the head of research at the Ottawa Forum in Israel-Palestine. So thank you so much. And we can now stop the, there we go. And Yousef, I'm going to turn to you first. Yousef, you know this situation from having been an elected member of Parliament. I know that, or Knesset, I know that you've been to the area many times. Help us understand what's going on, what the role of the JNF is, and what its specific role is in the Negev.
Yeah, thank you, Peter, for organizing this this discussion, and thank you all those who have joined us. And in fact, your presentation and your introduction, Peter, has helped me basically, to save some of the data and information about the situation, mainly in the Negev, and then the huge the issue and the status of the JNF, and I'm here sharing with you on the screen also my presentation, or at least the main points of my presentation. So as you started, Peter, in the Negev, in the Negev, south of Israel, tens of Arab Bedouin villages have been denied since Nakba, since 48, denied recognition by successive Israeli governments. And as a result, they are denied any infrastructure or support from the government. There is no means of transportation, no road, no schools, and the Israeli authority don't even cooperate with their local leadership. We're speaking about over maybe 120,000 of Arab Bedouins in these unrecognized villages. These policies of denying formal recognition should be seen as an integral part of the ongoing attempts to pressure the Bedouin residents of these villages into being internally displaced, to being uprooted, despite the fact that they have lived on or near these lands prior to Israel establishment back in 48. So
Yousef, can I interrupt for just a second, please? Yeah. I think it's better just to show your face. We can't really read the text while you're talking, and so you better just to, unless there's something specifically in the text you want to point us to.
So you prefer, okay. So
I think it's easier for us to understand you rather than trying to read the text while listening to you.
Okay.
I think that's better. You got a nice face anyway, so it's good.
Thank you. So while land is an essential resource for social and economic development, historically there has been a severe lack of land resources in the Arab towns and villages all over Israel. There has been acute housing shortages and the scarcity of land for building, which basically preclude virtually all development. I would like to point here to a new basically law that was adopted in Israel in 2018. This is the basic law, Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people, informally known as the nation state bill or the nationality bill. The law was passed by the Knesset in July 2018, which deepens these practices of land and housing discrimination against Arab citizens, including our community in the Negev. The law opens with the statement that the land of Israel is the historical homeland of the Jewish people in which the state of Israel was established, and that the right to exercise national self-determination in the state of Israel is unique to the Jewish people. Now, Article 7, very interestingly, of that law, as I said, it was enacted in 2018. Article 7 states that the state views the development of Jewish settlements as a national value and will act to encourage and to promote its establishment and consolidation. So this is the law that basically speaks clearly in terms of ethnic belonging and make it clear that that basically ethnic belonging and racial belonging and national belonging deeply matters in the Israeli politics and in the Israeli legal system.
Yousef, so, I'm being overruled. I've had several people say they'd rather have the text, so I'm wrong and go back.
That's fine.
Okay. Sorry.
Okay, I need now to basically.
Apologize.
Okay, so it's better to show the text there.
I've had several people write me in and say, please put the text back on. So, okay.
Okay. We'll try to maximize the text. Is it now better?
Yes, that's better.
Is it? It's readable more?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's good. Okay.
Yeah, but so since 1948, large tracts of Arab-owned land have been confiscated or otherwise appropriated under law and taken into the possession of the state or Zionist institutions such as the JNF, which, as you mentioned in your introduction, it clearly says in its set of laws that it serves exclusively the Jewish community. Today, the situation is that about 93% or over 93% of land in Israel is under the control of the state of Israel. Now, speaking about Israel's land, I think this is an important point. When we speak in Israel about Israel's land, that includes land owned by the state, one, land owned by the JNF, and land owned by the Development Authority. Now, of the 2,000 million dunams currently owned by the JNF, it constitutes about 13% of the total land in Israel. Now, close to 2 million dunams were transferred to it by the state following the establishment of the state in 1948 and in 1953, giving the JNF a special status under Israeli law. In fact, the practice of transferring public land, state land, to the JNF, a body that openly states that it serves the interest of the Jewish citizens of Israel, it has been used virtually and in a practice to prevent the Arab use of that land, especially in the Nakab. The JNF enjoys a huge influence over land distribution policy in Israel. For example, it nominates half of the members of the Israeli Land Authority Council. Now, although under Israeli law, state-owned land cannot be sold, that's part of the Israeli law, the JNF has a special status that enables the transfer of lands to it from the state. That based on an agreement signed between the state and the JNF back in 1961 that obliged the state to respect the objective of the JNF. These objectives include settling only Jews on the land and the properties without the Israeli government's jurisdiction. That's why tenders of the JNF lands have been opened only to Jews with the acknowledgement of the state. Now, this, I clearly say, this is definitely an illegal issue that contradicts the basic right of equality, whether, in my opinion, under the Israeli law, but it definitely contradicts the right of equality under international law. We, human rights activists, presented by Adan, civil rights group in Israel, petitioned the Israeli Supreme Court against this illegal function and this illegal status of the JNF. And importantly, in a JNF document submitted to the Israeli court back in 2004, the JNF argued that its loyalty is only to the Jewish people, not to the general public in Israel, and that it operates only for the benefit of Jews. The JNF further argued in the document that these are not legal issues, but are purely ideological matters relating to the character and identity of the Jewish state and the relationship between Jews in Israel and Jews in the diaspora. The JNF also argued that non-Jews don't have the right to use land given to the Jews. The JNF further claimed to have purchased its lands using money donated by Jews from around the world for the purpose of buying land in Israel and its distribution among Jews. In response to the petition, the Attorney General in Israel ruled in 2005 that the Israeli Land Authority cannot discriminate against Arab citizens of Israel in the marketing and allocation of the lands it manages, including lands belonging to the JNF. Now, this might be a positive development. However, there are two sides to the Attorney General ruling. On one hand, the decision is positive since it accepted our argument that the Israeli Land Authority policy of marketing and allocating lands to JNF-owned lands through bids open only to Jews is discriminatory. So, however, and that's the main point here, the Attorney General also decided that whenever a non-Jewish citizen wins an ILA tender for a plot of JNF-owned land, the Israeli Land Authority will compensate the JNF with an equal amount of land, a process that definitely involves the transfer of state-owned land to the JNF, an institution, as I said, which publicly acknowledged that its land policy is discriminatory. I think the question here is to confiscate the JNF for what? For basically leasing land to Arab citizens. So I think that this background just shows and tell us that the current decisions to forest land, mainly now in the Negev, must be viewed within the broader context of the general operation of the Israeli Land Authority, and in particular, further Israeli Land Authority decision regulating the process of the transfer of land to cooperative societies and regional councils in order to protect the land from, quote unquote, persons who would use it without permission, particularly in the Galilee and in the Negev. Such decisions also supplement the determined efforts of the ILO to uproot the unrecognized Arab Bedouin villages in the Negev. And Peter, when you mentioned the reasons why Israel is willing to jeopardize the Negev area, so of course I agree with the arguments that you argue there. But I think it's important to emphasize here that this is part of an attitude that looks at the Arab Bedouin community as part of the enemy, as a fifth column, not as a full citizens, as citizens who are entitled to full rights, as inferior citizens. And basically, we witness this continued effort to uproot them and to basically to preserve the situation of denying them their communities recognition and denying them basic governmental services. So afforestation in the Negev through the
we're going to have to move fairly. I disrupted you, and we also started late. So
I'm finishing here.
Okay.
I'm just finishing with the idea that basically the afforestation in the Negev through the JNF is a tool used by the Israeli government to continue to expropriate lands belonging to Arab Bedouin residents and serves to foster unbearable living conditions of the community. The excuse of afforestation or the establishment of nature reserves is used to limit the development of Arab villages and to preserve the land for the establishment of Israeli Jewish communities. And I think with the latest events we will hear from Adan, but I will finish by saying that the practice of planting forests to prevent Palestinians from returning to their homes is not new. Many JNF forests were planted on top of Palestinian villages destroyed in the 1948 Nakba and on lands of the unrecognized Bedouin villages in the Negev. Now, if we want to analyze this situation from American constitutional perspective, and I think from a Canadian perspective, I think we will reach a clear conclusion here that the JNF is practicing a clear discriminatory policies by basically discriminating against the Arab community, and it does that very clearly, as it says in its set of rules. In the US, there is the Fair Acting House that prohibit housing discrimination even in the private sector. So imagine that it will definitely prohibit such discrimination when it comes to public institution like the JNF. As I say, the JNF owns about 13% of the Israeli land in very strategic areas like the center of Israel, like in the Galilee. However, it continues to act to the exclusive service of the Jewish community and the excluding Arab Palestinian community. Well, this is a situation that cannot go along with the principles of equality, of fairness, of fair distribution of resources, and it becomes very, especially extreme when it comes to one of the important or most important even resources for any developments. I refer mainly to the issues of land and issues of housing. I think that today, in liberal norms of democracy and of equal citizenship, there is no place for institutions like the JNF that continue basically to discriminate against 20% of the citizens of Israel, namely the Arab Palestinian citizens. As I said, this issue is still going on, and as you said, Peter, it basically revealed the fact that the treatment of the Arab community is still based on a colonial vision of basically de-landing process and transferring land from Arab hands to Jewish hands, and as a result, we have witnessing, the latest wave of so-called afforestation, but the main aim of it is basically to continue to uproot the indigenous Arab Bedouin community in the Negev. So it's
That's terrific.
an ongoing challenge, and I hope that you could get an idea of what's going on these days also from Adan presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yousef. I was going to ask you a couple of follow-up questions, but I think in the interest of time, I'll move directly to Adan, and then at the end, we'll have a Q&A from the audience. I remind people, you could turn your screen off there, Yousef, your shared screen off. I remind people that if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A, not in the chat. You're quite free to exchange ideas on in the chat. I've already seen some people who don't agree with what Yousef has said, and that's fine. I'm happy to engage in a broad discussion here. Adan, I'd like to welcome you. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for I have to start off in that video that we saw. We didn't see very much of you because you were wearing a mask and a hijab. Now we see more of you, but it looked pretty stressful. How are you doing, like emotionally? How are you?
Wow. I can speak on behalf of all Palestinians, but more specifically the Bedouins living in Negev. Stressed and drained are not enough to describe what we're feeling right now. Under the circumstances that we're living in and the fight that we're fighting for, it's hard to stay positive and it's hard to stay hopeful. I think everybody is stressed in terms of we're worried about our community as a whole. And then, of course, every person is worried about their own family and their own home and their own safety, from the Israeli government and the OAV units and the Shabak.
Are you personally at risk physically? What's your where are you speaking to us from? You have police dogs outside your door? Like give us a description of what your immediate situation is.
Of course. So I am currently living in a recognized village called Lakia. That's where my mother's side is from. My father's side, where I grew up, is 2 meters away. The villages are connected to each other. It's just that the Israeli government chose to recognize only part of the village. So I originally live in Awajan, an unrecognized village. And as of currently, right now, I'm not in any physical danger, but during the peak of my activism, where there was a lot of media attention on me, unfortunately I can say that I was in physical danger, and I was called a terrorist by many Israeli Zionist extremists. I was constantly in danger of the Shabak coming and taking me for questioning, and it happens to a lot of Palestinian activists. And I think more specifically, I was worried for my safety as a woman, as a Bedouin woman in my community, because not only am I loud and I'm an activist, but I'm also a woman. So as Adan, I'm facing 2 types of conflicts, you could say. I'm facing the conflict as a Bedouin dealing with the Israeli government, and I'm also facing the conflict as a Bedouin dealing with my own community.
You speak English like I do. You sound like a Canadian. You're a Bedouin, which is a fairly conservative society. You're a very powerful young woman. So you're an Israeli citizen, I assume. So you have all these contradictory kind of definitions. How do you navigate those contradictory identities?
Of course, ever since I was younger, I was raised in a household where the conversation was politics and Palestine and the right of return for all Palestinians and the right to our land as Bedouins. And, I heard stories of my grandparents being refugees in Jordan and coming back and then getting moved to Tal Arad. So I've had a solid idea of who I am and my identity ever since I was little. I knew I was.
You're still little, Adan.
Yeah, since I was a child, you could say. So I always knew I was a Palestinian Bedouin, and not only that, a woman Palestinian Bedouin, and an activist. Ever since I was younger, I was in the 2013 protests against Brother. So I guess you could say I'm used to this. But
all right, so you say 2013 protest against Praver. I don't know that many people would know what you're referring to.
So, okay, so do you want me to,
just give one line on it or whatever.
Yeah, so the Praver plan was basically a plan to take all Bedouin land from all Bedouins, and thankfully it didn't go through, but generally that's the plan. So ever since I was younger, I've been protesting. But I do want to speak to the Canadian side of me. I lived half of my life in Canada. And while I was in Canada, I was actually in a group called Palestinian Youth Movement, PYM. And this group worked closely with the Indigenous citizens of Canada to protest. During the protests in March, we had multiple shared protests, because in the end of the day, our struggles are very similar, or were very similar. Just like the Canadian government and occupies Indigenous land, we are getting occupied by Israeli land. So we worked very closely to each other. And I think seeing the strength of the Indigenous people in Canada after all of these years is what really pushed me personally to not lose hope and continue fighting. Yeah.
So you've now returned, if not permanently, certainly for some time in Israel or Palestine, Israel, the south of. What are you doing there? What role have you taken up there?
Of course. So initially, I finished grade 12, and before going to university, I decided to take a gap year, and it's very important for me to give back to my community, and I'm very prideful in what I say, and I wanted more experience. So, I can stay in Canada and talk about Palestine this, Palestine that, but I wanted to live what I was speaking about. Of course, I lived it when I was younger, but it's different when you're actually aware of your surroundings. And in the end of the day, I am the woman I am today because of my community, and my community is lacking in many ways. specifically in the education aspect, the Bedouin schools are 7+ years behind the educational system in Israel. So it was very important to me to volunteer. So I'm here for a gap year where I'm volunteering with an NGO called Ajik. And through my volunteer work, I go to Bedouin Arab schools and I teach them English. And then I also teach them something that under the Israeli school board, they're not allowed to learn. But because I'm not under school board, I can teach them. My goal is to teach them about Palestinian history, Bedouin culture, who they are as Bedouins and who they are as Palestinians, because the awareness in the Bedouin community is not very high, or at least it wasn't up until like a couple of months ago. So that's my goal, you know, to prepare our children.
Help us understand a little bit the term Palestinians and Bedouins are not exactly the same thing. There's some difference. A lot of Palestinians are not Bedouins. And actually, I think it's probably true that not all Bedouins are Palestinian. I think probably there are Bedouins in neighboring countries as well. I'm not sure. So what's the overlap between Bedouin and Palestinian?
So Bedouin is actually a term for nomadic. The Bedouin population, there's Bedouins in Jordan, in Sinai, Egypt. Bedouin refers to a nomadic group of people with a nomadic lifestyle. Unfortunately, when we were occupied by Israel, our lifestyle was taken away from us and we were no longer able to continue our lifestyle of being nomadic. Now, I am a Palestinian Bedouin because my great-grandfather was nomadic and we lived in tents and we had fires and farms and animals. But there are Palestinians who were not nomadic. They were Palestinians who are just Palestinians and they aren't Bedouins. So today when we refer to Bedouins, we're not referring to the same dictionary definition of nomadic. We're just referring to a group of people that used to live a certain way. And we are still very close. We don't really, because again of the occupation and because we live in Al-Naqab, we don't mix with other Palestinians a lot. So we're very much by ourselves and we've held on to our nomadic lifestyle without being nomadic, if that makes sense. So we still farm, we still plant trees. This is why our land is so important to us, because we eat from our animals and we harvest our plants.
Right.
So,
have you personally seen the house demolition, the kinds of expulsions, arrests, and so on? Have you been there, seen that more than once?
Unfortunately, very sadly, I can say I have, and I've had personal experiences with it. As I said, my father's side of the family currently lives in an unrecognized village. And multiple times, you know, in Bedouin culture, before a young man gets married, he has to build a house for his wife and himself. My uncles, when they tried to get married, have built houses, and tens of times their houses have gotten demolished. My grandmother's house, my grandmother, a 70-something-year-old woman, had to beg to not have her house demolished, to get on her knees and beg. And I've seen that. And even during our recent clashes with the Israeli government and the UAV units, just to clarify, the UAV units are special police forces that were created for house demolitions and to deal with the Bedouin communities. They have no other role other than dealing with us, because apparently, you know, we're criminals to the Israeli government. Just recently, I've known people around me have gotten arrested, run over by motorcycles and horses in protests, shot at protests, and expelled from their houses. You know, there are a lot of people currently right now who aren't in their homes, who are seeking shelter in other Bedouin houses because their house was demolished. Right. And so I think being expelled and having your house demolished, they go hand in hand. And this is a fear that all Bedouins, even in recognized village, live in today. Because if we take a step back for a second, Sawa, the village where all of this is happening, is actually a recognized village. This is a recognized village, which means that the land of the people living on it is theirs from the Israeli government's rule. Yet they're still getting their land confiscated and they're still getting trees planted on their land. So I really don't know how much their recognition of our villages is important to us.
I just want to ask you two quick more questions before we go on to Grafton Ross. But you're talking about people being heard. I believe Yousef Jabareen, I believe that the leader of your party got shot by Israeli police during a demonstration against house demolitions or the eviction of a Bedouin some time ago, 3 or 4 years ago. I seem to remember that, if I'm not wrong. Adan, 2 quick questions. One is, what are you asking for? What are the Bedouins of Palestine asking for today? What do they want?
Very simple. What we're asking for as of right now, number one, we're asking for our right to protest to be given to us. Our protests have all been licensed, and we've from the Israeli government. Yet every time we've protested, we faced incredible violence from the Israeli side, incredible inhumane violence. Like at our last protest, where it was licensed, so there were children at the age of 5 and elderly the age of 85 at the protest, and we were shot at with rubber bullets, gas bombs, the stinky water tanks. They left nothing. We were demolished after that, and then they continued arrests. Actually, I wanted to correct us. Something I saw in the video. The video said 18 plus arrests. Actually, there have been 150 plus arrests, 40 of which have been arrests of youth under the age of 18. Actually, we have a case that there was a child he was 10 years old, and he was taken at 5 in the morning from his house for throwing rocks. So I just wanted to show what's been going on. Other than that, what we are asking for is very simple. We're asking for recognition and ownership over our land as indigenous people. The Bedouins of Al-Naqab, we make up 30% of the population of Al-Naqab, yet we live on 3% of the land. And they're still trying to confiscate this 3%. So we're asking them to stop confiscating this land and recognize that it's ours. That's the bare minimum. We're also asking for them to stop demolishing our houses and give us basic human rights, such as water, running electricity, and a shelter for us to live in. Sure. Because we're Israeli citizens, even if we don't like it, personally, I don't like it, but we are. So if I'm forced to be in the situation I am, then at least give me my rights.
Well, you're obviously a very brave and principled young woman, and we admire your courage under difficult circumstances. I'm going to leave it there for the moment, Adan. I'm going to turn to Grafton Ross. There is a Canadian connection here. It's the JNF that we've been talking about, that Yousef was talking about, expropriating land or for Jewish use only in Israel, and that Adan and her families are feeling the effects of. But there is a Canadian connection because there is an organization called JNF Canada. And I'm going to ask Grafton Ross to walk us through a little bit about JNF Canada and its role in helping the JNF take over Palestinian lands in historic Palestine, what is now Israel, and in the West Bank too. Grafton?
Thank you, Peter. Can you hear me okay?
Can.
Good. So I'm going to try and share screen. I'm going to try and pull back the curtain a little bit on the JNF Canada and the fundraising machine. Why is this not working?
We see that there, though it says click to add text, but if you
yeah, that's perfect. It's not working.
If you just go to the next slide, I think you're okay.
I don't think I know. Okay. Do you see the text on the side?
I do, yeah. So you just need to expand that if you can.
Yeah. I'm sorry, folks. We tested this yesterday. There we are.
There we go. Okay. Excellent.
Okay. So my role is to try and explain a little bit about what JNF Canada is and how it fits into this picture of what has been described going on in Israel. Now, I noticed in the question and answer, there were some questions about Canada Park, which is a particularly egregious example. And I'll say a few words about that. But mainly I want to pull back the curtain a little bit on the JNF Canada as a fundraising machine, how it goes about fundraising and what the implications of that are. So how does it raise its funds? What does it do with these donations? What does it mean to be a charitable organization in Canada? And what tax benefits can flow from that? Before I start, I'd like to give a shout out to Independent Jewish Voices of Canada, who've been leading a public education and mobilization campaign challenging JNF Canada's tax-free status, and they've had some remarkable successes. Well, what is JNF Canada? It began in Canada in 1906, formed as a separate department of the Zionist organization in 1922, and became a full-fledged independent nonprofit organization in 1962. Its stated purpose or object is to provide, enlarge, and administer a fund made up of voluntary contributions from the Jewish community of Canada and others to be used for charitable purposes. So it doesn't actually say exactly what its purposes are. Now, how does JNF Canada go about raising funds? Well, like all charitable organizations, it likes to emphasize the small non-tax receipted donations, and here sort of epitomized by the iconic blue box, that small tin can where you put your spare change and then take it into the community center when it's full. That actually does amount to a full third of JNF's fundraising. And I must give a acknowledgement to the Canada Revenue Agency. Most of the data that underlies this presentation come from the forms that charitable organizations are required to submit to Revenue Canada. So they raised a third of their fundraising was from these non-tax receipted sources, but like most charitable organizations, their largest contributions come from the tax receipted gifts. These are larger contributions where the donor is asking for a receipt. Other sources of income are government grants, which is one area which surprised me a little bit, and I'll come back to it. And investment income, this would be interest from bank deposits and so on. So what are these, if you like, these larger signature kind of events that are used by JNF Canada for its fundraising? Well, the classic one is the Negev dinner. It was started in 1948 and is an exclusively, uniquely Canadian Jewish community JNF Canada initiative. What it does is it honors a leading member of the community or a politician, Canadian politician. It's a high-priced sit-down dinner gala event and raises major funds for some signature project in Israel. Another main initiative is something called the Builders Circle. To be part of the Builders Circle, you must donate at least $6,000 and up to $500,000. And this allows you to fund an entire project, a smaller project or a portion of a project, and have a public recognition given to it. So what is a charitable organization in Canada? How can you become a charitable? You can't just say you're a charitable organization. You actually have to do charitable acts. There are 4 charitable acts that are recognized in Canada: relief of poverty, advancement of education, advancement of religion, and a kind of a catch-all other purposes of benefit to the community, which the law recognizes as charitable. So what kind of benefits do charitable organizations receive if you can attain this status? Well, the one that's most people know about are the tax-deductible contributions from donors. So if you give more than $200 in a year, you can deduct from a third to over a half of your income, depending on what province you are living in, for those charitable donations. And what this means is that if you say gave $1,000, $500, which would otherwise have gone into taxes, is now going to have to be made up by the other taxpayers of Canada. A second area of benefit is you are exempt from GST and HST, so for goods and services which you deliver. So if, say, it's a souvenir program or some other object or service, you are not required, you do not charge GST on it. Your property are exempt from municipal taxes in most jurisdictions, and you are eligible to apply for and receive government grants from provinces, the federal government, or municipalities. In 2020, which is the most recent data that we have, JNF Canada received a $932,000 federal government grant. I have been unable to determine what project that is in support of, but it puts it at the, I would say, at the higher end of recipients of government grants outside of the health and education sectors. The photo and press release below is of a provincial government grant, province of Alberta, $1 million check that was delivered to JNF Canada for a joint project on water conservation. So what kind of projects are undertaken in Israel? JNF has been accused of greenwashing. And what is greenwashing? Greenwashing is when a state or an organization appeals to environmentalism in order to deflect attention from its harmful practices. Now, we've been hearing about the harmful practices, the forced evictions and displacements and home demolitions. This is all kind of cloaked in the environmental, as an environmental initiative, whether it's tree planting or some kind of rehabilitation. In this case, we're seeing a series of reservoirs that have been constructed along the Besor River system, which is in the northwestern part of the Negev. Canada didn't build this particular reservoir, but the principle is the same. The idea is to capture and store excess water to recharge the groundwater and to provide water for irrigation. But again, you must recognize that JNF is focused on, it supports the Jewish population of Israel. And indeed, if you look at the map on the top left, the map index is somewhat interesting in this, and I'm sure it was perhaps not intentional, but you can see the way they have classified the population. All of the Bedouin that we're talking about today are Israeli citizens. Nevertheless, on the map, they are shown as being somehow different. The other factor I'd like to draw from this particular slide is all of this rainwater and river flow, which is being captured here in the Negev, would normally flow to the Gaza Strip, where it would serve the population there. It is all blocked. Hardly a drop of water actually reaches the Mediterranean Sea at this point. This is a Facebook post that JNF Canada put up a couple of years ago. What they're trying to do here, it was part of a series where they were promoting the environmental initiatives that KKL JNF Israel was undertaking. And here they're talking about the planting of date palms and the fact that they require irrigation of 1,000 liters of water per day. What's missing from this is the fact that this particular region that they're speaking about is in the occupied West Bank, it's in the Jordan Valley, and that the Palestinians that live in that same Jordan Valley get an average of 73 liters of water per day, not 1,000. Here's another one. We spoke about Canada Park earlier. This is being promoted as a environmental initiative, but in actual fact, it was built upon the ruin of 3 Palestinian villages, which were destroyed, were bulldozed in 1967. The residents were forcibly expelled, and those who didn't remain within the boundaries of Israel were never allowed to return. So what happens when the public start to see through the deception, through the greenwashing? Well, it's time for rebranding. What we see above is the old brand of the Jewish National Fund of Canada. You can see it's on the left. The one on the right is the logo of KKL JNF Israel. And you can see that JNF Canada in its logo has tried to mirror and reflect its parent company, its parent organization in Israel. As a result, partly as a result, mainly as a result of the initiative by IJV Canada, JNF Canada has felt the pressure and has had to rebrand itself. And now you see something that looks totally different. There's no reference at all to KKL JNF Israel. It's as if they were two completely different entities that just happened to share 3 letters. In Canada, we have an organization called Charity Intelligence. They review all of the charitable organizations in Canada along a series of measures: financial transparency, reporting of results, their need for funding, and how many cents out of each dollar go to the cause. You can see their analysis of JNF Canada. This is based on 2019 data. Their charitable activities, their actual work, charitable work, makes up only 43 cents out of a dollar. Their overhead, that is their fundraising and their management and administration, makes up a full 57%. So JNF Canada gets a failing grade from Charity Intelligence's standpoint. However, I would make the argument that JNF Canada's fundraising is doing precisely what it's designed to. That is, the Negev dinners are designed to be major community events where the people hobnob and you increase the cohesion of the community and its attachment to Israel. The actual programming is, of course, important, but it's not the entire goal of these events. And with that, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Grafton. Thank you for that research you did. Your presentation leads me to ask a couple of questions before we turn it open to the audience. I remind people to put your questions in the Q&A box, and including questions that they don't have to be friendly questions. They can be unfriendly questions. We're happy to try to deal with all questions that you put forward. Grafton, first of all, is it, I think you referred to a parent organization. Is JNF Canada like a wholly owned subsidiary of JNF Israel? Like what is their relationship as far as you can make out?
Oh, they're entirely independent. They, as I say, they share 3 letters. Legally, they're entirely independent. However, they clearly, in the past, they were a fundraising wing of KKL JNF.
And they share the same, broadly the same objective, right?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, right.
Yes, indeed. And in fact, almost all of the program spending of JNF Canada is in Israel.
Okay. You also mentioned 3 different sources of funding. One is the Blue Box, one is the Builders Circle, and the third of the JNF dinners, the Negev dinners. Now, would it be fair to assume that the Blue Boxes are basically aimed at Jewish families? Not very many non-Jews would contribute or be asked to contribute to the Blue Box. And presumably, if someone was looking to make a $500,000 donation, it's more likely to be a Jewish Canadian, not exclusively, but more likely. But the Negev dinners bring in all kinds of people because these are big gala events to which tables are sold in law firms and major banks and so on. So a lot of that money would be coming from outside the Jewish community. Is that a fair assumption, or do you think that's stretching it?
Well, you know, I've never been invited to a Negev dinner, and I don't think I can afford it.
It's only $1,000 a plate, Grafton.
Yeah, it tends to be. I think currently maybe a little less because many of them are virtual, but they tend to be a couple of $1,000s a plate. So $16,000 to $20,000 for a table, for example. So it's not surprising that they would attract corporate sponsors.
I remember one year in particular, Prime Minister Stephen Harper was invited. He played the piano at it, and there were all kinds of corporate tables were sold, and there were also nice speeches about JNF Canada and about JNF and about Israel. So a lot of the money that was spent ends up being part of call it promotion or propaganda or whatever, representing Israel in a positive sense. I'll stop my questions there and open it up to the audience for questions. I say, please, our secretary, Yasmin, you've been keeping an eye on questions. I've been not doing so. What would be, give us the first question that you want to toss and help us find out who should answer it, please.
For sure. So I'm going to start with a question to Grafton. There's a couple of questions here asking about the Independent Jewish Voices campaign, where they were calling for the charitable status of the JNF Canada to be revoked. People want to know what's the process been like, what has the outcome been, where are they at in their fight?
Yes, thank you for the question. And we can put up the web address in the chat, if you will, Madam Secretary. ijvcanada.org, and I think they have a separate site for the Stop the JNF.ca, I think is perhaps the other site. This is a campaign that's been going on for several years. It's involved public education. It involved preparing a petition, which was submitted in Parliament, got sponsorship from one of the members of Parliament, and was submitted, and was replied to. It met the threshold that it had to, that required a government reply. It is also, as I mentioned, with the rebranding, and that's just sort of the symbolic visual side of it, it has forced JNF Canada to account much more closely for its activities and manage much more closely the activities that Canadians pay for in Israel. However, that they still trade on their connection to JNF, and so while they've legally separated themselves, they have not in terms of how they position themselves.
Thank you. Secretary, Madam?
Sure. I also want to take this chance to thank Adan and Yousef for making it and for joining us. I know it's quite late where you guys are, so we really appreciate you being here with us. My next question is to Adan. Dorcas is asking, what is the most important thing Canadians can do to support your work on the ground?
Thank you for the question. Right now, and since the month of May with the Sheikh Jarrah and everything that's been going on in Palestine, the thing that we need help with most is getting our voices out to the Western world. What we're struggling with today is our main source of teaching and educating people is social media. If you want to learn more, that's where you go these days, specifically Instagram. But we are struggling to get our voices heard by Canadians and Americans. Usually the people that see our content and are paying attention to what's going on to us are surrounding Arab countries. So as Canadians, you know, you could also spread your messages or what you believe or information about what's been going on through social media. And there are groups such as Palestinian Youth Movement and Canadian Sanctions Israel and GPM, which are all located in Canada, that you could follow and stay updated with, because they post content that is going on here. And if you want, there's a lot of activists, including myself and Yousef and a lot of people like us, who post daily, because again, social media is the way to communicate these days. And so I think helping us spread the message worldwide is the best thing you could do, and we would really appreciate it. Thank you.
On that point, we are recording this event. We will make a video of this recording available to everybody who registered for it, and certainly feel free to share it as widely as you want with your own network. So thank you, Adan. Yasmin?
Sure, Peter. There's a question here which is asking how the Bedouin citizens of the Negev are able to collaborate with other Palestinian Israelis, considering their exclusive resident status versus citizenship status. So I think there's a little bit of confusion on that point, on which Palestinians in Israel have residency versus citizenship. So Yousef, if you'd like to speak to that, please go ahead.
Yeah, but it's important to emphasize we are one community. I mean, we are. All the vast majority of the Arab Bedouin community in the Negev, they hold Israeli citizenship, and they are integral part of the Arab Palestinian minority within Israel. And today we are speaking about 250,000. So it's a large community, and also in terms of voluntary organization, we have one umbrella group. That's the High Follow-up Committee for Arabs in Israel, which basically represent all of the Arab Palestinian minority in Israel, including the Arab Bedouin community. So we are one community. And in fact, as a community now, we are seeing that that our community in the Negev is being targeted in recent years, and this is basically the only strategic land that we have so far as an Arab community. It's in the south, in the Negev. All of the other land that we used to have been confiscated. That's why the struggle of our community in the Negev is basically on the top agenda of the entire Arab Palestinian community within Israel, and many of the activities are basically initiated also by as I said, the national representative body of the High Follow-up Committee of Arabs in Israel. I think it's important maybe to emphasize toward the end of this maybe discussion, and after hearing also the presentation about JNF Canada, I think I could say clearly that the JNF in Israel is working in contradiction of basic civil rights and human rights norms of equality, of fairness, and equal citizenship. It says that frankly and clearly in Israel. It's now also starting to be more active in the occupied Palestinian territories by basically supporting the settlement process in the West Bank, and we see that as part of the project of expanding settlements. This definitely goes against all international conceptions about the solution of two-state solution and the illegal occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, including East Jerusalem. So I think that the work of the JNF in Israel is in a clear contradiction with, as I said, international basic norms, definitely with Canadian norms of equality and fairness, and maybe it's about time for Canadian liberals and Canadian supporters of peace and of equality and of justice to step in and to do something about it. The JNF is an integral part of the oppression of our community in the Nakab, and the oppression of the against the entire Arab community within Israel, and also oppression against our Palestinian people in general. So this is an extreme situation, and as Adan said, we definitely need the international support for our just cause against these discriminatory and oppressive practices of the JNF that are still going on even when we are speaking right now.
One thing that this discussion brings forward is I think that many Canadians are aware of Israel's house demolitions and so on in the occupied territories, but they're not so much aware of the fact that the same thing is going on in the Negev to people who are citizens of Israel. A lot of people think, I believe, that while there maybe the word apartheid could be used in the West Bank, that it's really not very applicable in Israel. But certainly, at the very least, you've got to say this is a discriminatory policy that said, I don't know whether either of you used the word apartheid, which was the word used by by the Amnesty International report. But one of the new and significant things about the Amnesty report is that they said that Israel was exercising a regime of apartheid over all the area that Israel rules over, including Israel itself. We get time for one more question, Yasmin, and then we're going to have to move to wrapping up.
Sure. So I've got two, and I think I'll let you make the decision on which one you'd like to answer. They're really interesting, and I'd like to address both, but we don't have time. So there's one question which is posed to Yousef, which is asking, what's the impact of Palestinian members of the Knesset, and what changes can they make to improve the situation? The second question, I'll pose it to you, Peter. It's, what does the United Nations Security Council have to say about the Negev? If it is Israeli, part of Israeli territory, is it illegitimately so, like Jaffa and Tel Aviv and Haifa? Peter, go ahead.
Yeah, I think I will go ahead and then maybe leave for Peter for the final word. I mean, we do our best, whether as a member of the Knesset or as activists on the ground, or as I said, there is the voluntary umbrella group, the high follow-up committee. So whether as also member of that voluntary group, including organizing, demonstrations in the Nakab, demonstration in front of the Prime Minister office. In terms of parliamentary work, we initiate, a lot of discussions in the Knesset, meetings with, different officials in order, to try to, if it's meeting to convince them, and if it's a demonstration to, raise our voices against this oppression. We believe that our strength is in our unity as a community. Now about 1,600,000 citizens of Israel, and we believe that our strength is also in our popular struggle on the ground, and we have a hope that we could do that, because we believe that our cause is a just cause, and we have also feel confident in the new generation of our community, like Adan and the wonderful youth movements in the Nakab and generally. So and we see it as this is a long march. This is a long march for equality, for first-class citizenship for all, and we will continue this struggle. We don't have the luxury of just sitting in our homes while our houses are being demolished and our land is being confiscated. So this is an ongoing struggle, and we will keep this struggle from one generation to another.
Thank you. On the other question, I just got to say I am definitely not an expert. As we all know, that the United Nations has essentially voted the partition plan and then admitted Israel to be a member of the United Nations in 1949 and accepted that, unlike the partition plan, that Jaffa would be part of Israel, that the Negev is part of Israel. So the UN would regard this all as internal issues. I don't know whether the Human Rights Council has dealt with it or not, but the UN deals with it differently than it does with what the UN calls the occupied territories of 67. And that's, I'm not going to, that's a longer discussion. I'm going to leave it there, but that's my understanding of the situation. I'd like to, I do want to thank our three speakers, but before doing so, I'd like to just talk a little bit about what's coming up at OFIP. So I can just see that slide for a moment. I ask our speakers to hold on quickly while I say a couple of things, and then I'll come back to them. First, I want to remind everybody that our organization, OFIP, is voluntary and self-financed. We don't, unlike the JNF, we don't get any government grants at all, and we don't have a tax deductible status, and that's done on purpose so that we will not have to report to CRA about what we're doing and so on and so forth. But we live on small donations, so please, if you feel like it, send an e-transfer to ofip.finance@gmail.com. I'll also take a moment to tell you what our next activity is. Next month, we're going to be talking about Hamas. Now in Canada, Hamas is a boogeyman. Hamas is sort of seen as evil incarnate, but it is a political party. It has an origin, it has support, and clearly it's a significant political factor in the Israel-Palestine equation. And we're going to ask some experts who have experience from different areas of Palestine talking about Hamas. The last slide is, oh yes, so if you want more information about us, you can go on the www.ottawaforumip.org, which is the website of our organization, or I publish a weekly blog at www.canadatalksisraelpalestine.ca, and I was sending out this information to you afterwards. But now I'll flip back to my the sharing screen, and I'll flip back to take a moment to thank our speakers. First of all, I'll thank our secretary, Yasmin, in the background. Thank you very much for handling things so efficiently in the background. I thank all our speakers, all our audience for staying with us. I will start off with thanking my colleague, Grafton Ross, for the research you did on JNF Canada and for referring us to the campaign that IGV Canada has taken on that. I want to thank my friend, now my old friend, Yousef Jabareen, who I was so pleased to meet many years ago and have followed a little bit of your spectacular political career, and glad to remain in contact with you, Yousef. That's great. And a new person who I had not met before, Adan Alajooj. Adan, thank you so much for for being who you are, standing up for right as you see it, and for informing us on what is happening in the Negev today. So thanks to all of you. And thank you very much for your questions. And I will be following up to an email with all of you. Once again, my name is Peter Larson, and I'm the chair of the Ottawa Forum on Israel-Palestine. Thank you so much and have a great day.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you.